Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by one of the great economists, Professor Richard Wolff, to discuss some of the economics surrounding the Ukraine war. So, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Glad to be here.
Although, if we put aside the military and the political framing of the Ukraine war, I would like to ask you a bit about how you characterize the economic relevance around this war, because I mean, why was it so important, you think, to pull Ukraine into the Western orbit, for example, from 2008? I ask because many knew that this would likely trigger a war. We have from Angela Merkel, various ambassadors, the CIA director William Burns. A lot of people predicted this. I'm not sure if there is any, but do you see any economic relevance to where Ukraine is, or is this primarily political?
No, I think, as usual, it's a mixture. It's political, it's economic, ideological, military. I mean, whatever you want. I don't believe in single explanations in general, and I certainly don't see it here. Uh, Let me talk a little bit about the economics in an expansive way, because I think it grasps for people what the economic aspect of all of this was. And I take my clue from comments made by President Biden and many members of his administration, and even more by the kinds of academic and media spokespersons for the Democratic Party leadership at that time. And by the way, very little dissent from the Republicans, almost none. What the Democrats were articulating was basically what the Republican Party supported. Just so people know, it was important for Mr. Trump to give himself any chance at all to succeed. And remember, he came from the margins of the Republican Party, where the mainstream of the Republican Party, the Bush family, and all of that ridiculed him and mocked him, took him totally unseriously, in a way not so different from how the Democratic Party establishment dealt with Bernie Sanders. In both cases, catastrophic miscalculations by the establishment about how dangerous and vulnerable their situation was. But one of the things Mr. Trump did to drive the wedge in was to express the unspeakable, which is skepticism about the whole Ukrainian event. That was a way for him to show how different he is. You know, his denunciation of Mexicans as though they were all rapists, was so crazy, it helped define him as different. Well, the issue of Ukraine did the same, and by the way, does so to this day as I'm speaking to you. All right, so let's go back. What was the consensus? The consensus had a number of dimensions. I'm going to focus on the economic. And in the case of the economic, the Europeans, whose economic situation was already, in their minds, particularly those with some ability to see in the future a little, to ask questions a little, that they were already aware that the ancient vulnerability of Europe, that it was caught between the Soviet Union and the United States and had to navigate its position allied with the United States for sure, but always worried about its in-betweenness, that this was becoming worse because right behind Russia and becoming much more important economically than Russia ever was China. And that China actually was a bigger pole, and the United States was the other pole, and Europe was not so strong. When you look to where high tech was, when you look to Silicon Valley, and you look to the ability of the Chinese, unlike anything in Europe, to imitate or even go beyond the United States, they were worried. And a successful destruction of Russia, and I'm using my words carefully, as an economic anything would be very attractive. Not only would it remove a scary possibility, old and deeply ingrained in European consciousness. I think you can see how deeply by the last few years of demonizing Putin as if he were another Stalin. I mean, bizarre kind of hyperbole as politics. So there was the hope of diminishing Russia, but then there was greed, and don't misunderstand that or don't neglect that. There was fantasy that it was the right moment. Russia was very weak. It never had, in the Western mind, recovered from the collapse of the Soviet Union back in 1989 and 1990. Its army was nothing to be worried much about. So it was the right moment. You could push NATO yet another step beyond those it had already taken. Russia didn't do much about the other movements east that had happened. So you could entertain the idea, which was explicit here in the United States, I don't know about Europe, that you could break up Russia. Russia is a huge country and could be broken up into various geographic regions, maybe various ethnic differences, and so forth and so on. And that this would be a long-term project whose greatest benefit would be to Europe, because it would be, if you allow me, the Western Europeans, British, French, German, Italian, who could colonize, officially or unofficially, the broken up subdivisions of the ancient Soviet Union. This is an old idea in Europe, but it was very active, and it was joined here by a sense that we had never adequately, here in the United States, taken advantage economically of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this would be our chance. The Chinese would not get drawn in because they don't want to have to deal with the United States yet. For the Chinese, time is on their side, which, by the way, the last 30 years demonstrate for anyone who pays attention. The Chinese economy grows on average 2 to 3 times faster, if you measure in terms of GDP per year, than the United States, including this year right now and the last 25, which means that China each year is a more formidable economic competitor than it was the year before. And this is frightening the United States on all kinds of levels and destroying its major ally, particularly militarily, Russia, and geographically, Russia, and even shoring up Europe. Not that that's a major priority anymore, but in the minds of the Biden-type leadership, that was going on. So it was an economically driven, as much as anything else, in terms of relieving and solving certain problems, old ones, and temptingly putting forward a prospect that would be fantastic as a project for the rest of the 21st century, namely really integrating Russia from the Caucasus all the way over to the Pacific Ocean into a Western-shaped, Western-directed capitalist system. This was very, very attractive. Look, people shouldn't misunderstand. These kinds of projections of what might be have always been an important part of capitalist strategy. When Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon decide to go to China in the early 1970s and open it up as if it were closed, what they were responding to was a demand from the United States watching that Europeans and Japanese were doing good business in China because they recognized China, the United States didn't, that this was a prospect of the United States shooting itself in the foot, and they weren't going to do it anymore. And they were less ideologically worried, the way the Democrats are always worried that they might be leftists. So they can't do it. The Republicans do it. And you can see that again now with skepticism about Ukraine being definitive for Mr. Trump. But now that he's been elected and he doesn't need to distinguish himself anymore, he's not appealing to votes. He may not be able to succeed himself given the existing constitution here. He can't run again. Well, this kind of consideration diminishes, and you can begin to see now he needs to be careful not to push his enemies too far. And the Ukraine issue is still enough of an issue that he's shifting toward them rather than making them shift toward him.
It does seem that a lot of the planning for Europe after the Cold War was premised on that the relationship with Russia was going to be about managing its decline as opposed to accommodating on the continent. I mean, the idea of managing Russia's decline, this was also recognized unfavorably, though, by Clinton's defense minister, William Perry, back in the 1990s. And otherwise, how can you have the largest European state being the only European state that doesn't have a seat at the table in Europe? The contradictions, I guess, would grow. So I do think that the whole idea of creating this Europe without Russia was premised on the idea that Russia would remain weak and it would only get weaker and ideally go the same way as the Soviet Union. And we even hear people across Europe, from the Polish president Duda to the foreign policy chief of the European Union, talking about how great it would be if we defeat Russia, because then there would become many smaller nations, which we can then, they call it a prison of nations. They could be broken up to 200 small nations. I mean, this is kind of insane, but yeah, I don't think we know in Europe how to deal with Russia, which is now the fourth largest economy in the world in terms of purchasing power parity. That is, how can it be an isolated entity at the periphery of Europe that looks to Europe for leadership but doesn't have a say in decision making? The whole framework is undermined by the mere economic prosperity of Russia, though.
But this has been true for quite a while in one way or another. For me, I'm watching all of this from New York City. I'm watching it from the United States. I live in a country where the only way to describe this is a massive case of what psychologists call denial. We're a nation in which, from our president on down, we require of our leading politicians to speak and act as if the United States were in the social and global position that it occupied in the 1960s and 70s, in which it was such a dominant presence economically in terms of the share of world trade that the United States was involved in, or the share of world capital movements, or the role of the US dollar, or the on and on and on, and the 700 military bases. Nobody was in a position to make a peep about it. Even the Russians, yes, they had the nuclear weapons and they had to be taken seriously, but economically, nobody took them seriously. I mean, I remember going through, and I'm a product of the elite universities here in the United States, and I would sit in as I was getting my PhD in economics at Yale and at Harvard, at Stanford, the schools I attended. We would have visitors from Russia, and economists, professors of economics, and they would come and they would give a paper the way people do in academic departments, and we would mingle with them and talk with them, and it's like we were all together, and they were people coming from an underdeveloped country. it was the part of Yale called the Economic Development Program. It's in a particular building on the Yale campus in New Haven, Connecticut, and we would meet there as if it were the appropriate thing. Nigeria would send an economist one week, and Bangladesh the second, and Russia the third. And it was an underdeveloped economic unit. Yes, it had to be taken seriously, but not really. All of that is over, but you don't get that here. And I don't think I don't see it in Europe either. I see the almost to the point of ridiculous level of hostility towards Russia, is outpouring of verbiage that makes no sense and is diplomatically, self-contradictory. And your question, how do you arrange for a security architecture of Europe minus its largest? I mean, it's a joke. And not a good one. And it leads nowhere good, as this war shows you. Without Russia, you were able to get the momentum going. With Russia, you might have had a very different outcome to the whole Ukraine situation. You might have gone back to what they tried to do back in the early days of the war, which is to cobble together an arrangement to get out of this silly war that whose endpoint everybody knew. You can't put Russia, unless your idea is that Russia is so deteriorated militarily and economically that it is basically just waiting to be pushed over. And if that was their actual mistake, which I think in part it was, it tells you how out of touch their rhetoric and their thinking has become. And there, another word about the economic aspect of the war, which is the sanction program, more than anything else. That sanction program, in my judgment, will go down as one of the catastrophic miscalculations of any warring party. Stunning. I don't know how many iterations we've had now. I believe number 19 or 20 is the latest number applied to the sanctions package being negotiated among the Europeans. But you have 20 because each of the previous one failed. It failed. I mean, how many do you have to do before you question the logic of it all? And then when the Europeans themselves admit that they are hobbled by their energy price, and that their energy price is what it is in large part because they cut themselves off from Russian oil and gas, and you can't quite believe it. And then the whining, gee, the Russians went to China and India to sell their oil and gas. Well, what in the world did you imagine they would do? What? You didn't think about this? You're a strategic planner, and you didn't ask, now let's see. We cut them off. That hurts them. How do they respond? You don't do, I thought that's what planners and strategists do. They evidently didn't do it. The sanctions don't work. By the way, there's a huge literature. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's a literature in economics. Like there's a literature about tariffs, so we have an idea what tariffs have done in the past, when they've succeeded, when they failed, why, and so there's a literature about sanctions. And one of the lessons of that literature is they don't work. It's a little murkier with tariffs. Tariffs, they work under certain conditions, not under others. But the United States, who has a sanction, nobody in the world sanctions like the United States. We're far ahead away of any other country in the world. And the primary case we have now is Cuba. We've been sanctioning Cuba for 70 years, or whatever it now is, 70 years, and we can't overthrow that government. We can't do it. The sanctions are absolutely a failure there, even though we've hobbled that country and hurt it very badly, no question. But the goal was never to hurt it or not hurt it. The goal was to change the regime. Doesn't work. And it is a testimony, in my judgment, to what we are observing, which is very historic. I think we are watching the decline of the Western Empire and the emergence either of a genuinely multinational alternative, the dream of the League of Nations and the United Nations, the two efforts after horrific wars to try not to have that again. Either we'll have that, or we're going to have a Chinese empire replacing the American, much as the American replaced the British.
Yeah, this is the the economic decisions are quite extraordinary. I'm not sure. The first 20 didn't work, but they're gonna hope for a 21st sanction package. I mean, you can't really make this up. But another rule of sanctions, a lesson is that extreme and prolonged sanctions, they teach the sanctioned countries to learn to live without you. I mean, this is an important lesson, and this is why I think before we began all these sanctions, we should assess to what extent that means decoupling ourselves from the Russians. To what extent can they diversify away from us, and to what extent can we diversify away from them? And I think it should have been very predictable that they had advantage in this equation. But I wanted to ask you though about let's call it an economic meltdown in Europe, because things obviously are not going well there. And it seems obviously a lot of problems have other sources. So the failure to digitalize the industries, to have proper technological sovereignty, a skilled worker base. I mean, there's a lot of problems or criticism, but it seems that a lot of our problems also comes from the Ukraine war. I'm not sure. Again, as you said before, there's not one simple explanation, but how do you explain this decline of Europe? Is it all about cutting ourselves off from the energy from Russia, which is, again, the lifeblood of industries? Is it the threats to seize or steal the Russian funds? Is it the excessive subordination to the US, threats of sanctioning the whole world with secondary sanctions? I mean, I guess you can make a long list there, but how do you assess what is happening to Europe now? Because it's something is definitely going very quickly off the rails, and as the economy goes south, the political class seems to go increasingly crazy, I would say.
Well, I think the Europeans are caught in the decline of the West. I think the Ukraine war simply accelerated and made much more visible, partly because of the speed you point to, that things are going quickly now. I'm reminded of what a quotation that I've always learned attributed to Lenin when he's having this conversation with Stalin and Trotsky and his other advisors, and they're complaining that change takes so long. And then Lenin is quoted as saying to them, "For decades, nothing happens. And then in a few weeks, decades happen." Okay, I think that Ukraine is those few weeks, and suddenly what has been going on is accelerated, and by its acceleration, rendered visible, at least to enough more people that it enters into the larger conversations going on around the world. But I don't think it's attributable. It wasn't caused by the Ukraine war, but it was accelerated sharply, and so we see it now. So what are the problems? Well, I think you've given the answer I would give, and that is that Europe was used to running the world. It was the global center for several centuries. It was the place from which colonialism came and which organized the whole world to be adjuncts to a development shaped and governed by the capitalism born in England, spread to Western Europe, etc., and then became global. I remember writing my doctoral dissertation about Kenya and East Africa, the economic development of that. And I went to Kenya, I went to London, studied the records. What was fascinating to me was the way the British Colonial Office literally planned, as best they could, how to profitably fit in the Kenyan economy on East Africa to the British Empire. What should be grown there? Who should do the growing? Where should the railroad be located? What's the best harbor? Everything was about fitting that economy into the Britain of the late 19th and early 20th century when that colony was created in East Africa by the British. So that even when the British were forced out by the Mau Mau Rebellion in the 1950s, what was left behind was a legacy institutionally grounded in that society, making it dependent on the West, on serving England. Kenya grew coffee and tea because that was a market dominated by the British on a global scale, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they even had the rule, we must be able to tax the local economy enough so that the British economy is not subsidizing. We don't want to have to pay any money. These colonies have to pay for themselves. So not only do you fit it in to the British economy, but you don't tap the treasury of the British economy to do so. It very Does that mean killing half the population? Yes, that was the price. About half of it was wiped out, and the other half was put in reservations. That's what they were called, reservations. Other people would call them concentration camps. We call them reservations. Okay. To this day, the people of Kenya are trying to sort out how to emerge, and they're not doing all that good a job of it, out of that constraint. But you have to be sympathetic with them because it really is a straitjacket. Okay, why do I say this? I don't think Europe to this day understands that it's lost that position, that it isn't the leader, it isn't the center of the universe, it isn't. It just little bits of it still are. So, publish more books than anybody else does, and a variety of other interesting things. And I'm not taking away from the achievements of European culture and so forth. I admire them myself, but it's not the center of economic anything anymore. That has moved. It's moved to the United States. That happened quite a while ago. And now it has moved to China. And between the United States and China and their problems, it is becoming global, slowly, but becoming globalized. I spent yesterday studying the enormous achievements of the electric car industry in Vietnam. That's a sign, right? That wouldn't have happened too many years ago. That this country, Vietnam, is becoming a player in the international electric automobile business. All right, now what is it about Vietnam that makes me bring it up? Your point. Vietnam, because it was run by the Communist Party of North Vietnam, because that party defeated the United States in the Vietnam War ending in 1975, it has been closed off from help from the West, the way China was. And as I believe Henry Kissinger once said, in a moment of lucidity, he didn't have that many of those, but in a moment of lucidity, he explained that the best thing that could happen to a foreign country was not to be an ally of the United States, because he recognized that the economic development of China and now Vietnam are testimonies to the extraordinary achievement of people that are cut off from the European colonial project, not allowed, not given help, shut down. You can't export here. You can't import here. You can't get loans from here. You can't. We'll thwart you at every chance we can, and then we'll frighten you with military, so you have to spend a disproportionate amount of your money on this wasteful activity of bombs that you store in a warehouse hoping never to use them. This is the irrationality is spectacular. If you're free of that, or relatively at least, wow. You know, as a professor of economic development, we try to tell students, look, starting in World War II, at the end of World War II, American economics shifted so that an important part of our profession was economic development, the particular problems of poor countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and so on, who want to not be poor anymore as their top priority. How do we help understand what's holding them back and provide what they need to do policy-wise to become better off? Okay, the greatest success story of the post-war period is the People's Republic of China, which was frozen out of what the profession studied, of the money, of the support, of the. They did it best who did it on their own. The lesson here is so spectacular, it has to be excluded from all discussions here in the United States, unless the handful of us like me, the marginalized ones, bring it up. And then there's a moment of silence. I had that once not so long ago at Columbia at a seminar. There's a moment of silence when everyone takes in what I said because they know it's correct. And I think they're honestly wondering to themselves, why have we not thought about that? And the answer, I think, is the same for Europe. They didn't think about it. You have to develop a high-tech center. You have to do that. The United States did it with enormous subsidies. Where were this? Well, what happened in Europe? You had the money. You're a bigger economic unit than the United States is anyway. You can come up. No, the Europeans made a deal. They made a deal to live under the umbrella of the American military, which has a very dangerous way, which they should have known, of being also under the umbrella of the American high tech, because the military and the high tech mutually subsidize each other in this country. And they have since the end of the Second World War. The Europeans could see it. I can see it. They can see it. But they didn't do it. They lived under the umbrella of high tech and military. And they chose, therefore, to create a wealth class, but also to use the money they saved from military to create and subsidize social welfare. Now that they're not getting the support from the United States, they're going to all build up their military and shut down their social welfare, and they wonder why their societies are exploding. You can't do that. You can't even do it here in the United States. And we have the added 75 years of relentless anti-socialist, anti-communist propaganda. And even we can't do it. Mr. Trump is in trouble. And he's in trouble in the end because he's cutting back on social welfare. And the mass of people, including millions who voted for him, will not do that again.
It's quite strange that this this is becoming almost an alien topic, because this was the U.S. experience after its a war of independence. That is, under Hamilton, Henry Clay, they recognized they needed economic independence in order to solidify its political independence. I mean, this is why the American system was organized around the idea that the free trade empire of the British will put shackles on the United States. I mean, its independence movement entailed economic independence, financial independence. I think that, as you suggested, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, I would put Russians in the category as well. The luxury of being an adversary of the United States is if you recognize that economic dependence can be weaponized, you then prioritize economic autonomy. That is technological autonomy, financial autonomy. And in that process, not only do you become more sovereign, but you also cut off the foreign rent seekers. And I think for Europe, we always, well, for the past 80 years, had such a close and good relationship with the United States. We didn't see any need to have any strategic autonomy. But now, of course, that we reached the end of the road, that is, the US is now in deep economic trouble and it's starting to squeeze its allies, we're realizing, oh, wait, we don't have our own technologies. We don't have our own supply chains. We don't have our own development banks. If we don't have our own payment system, and we don't have our own military defense. So we end up now they're talking about reinventing everything. But once you're under this deep American dependence, the Americans can tell us to, well, cut yourself off from the Chinese and the Russians and anyone else you would need to actually diversify. And so no, I think you're probably very correct on this. I
Glenn, if
Yeah.
I could, here's almost a question to you. One of the things that amazed many of us here was when Ursula von der Leyen agreed, if we understand correctly, that as part of a deal to make the tariffs lower than they otherwise might have been, the Europeans committed, and to my knowledge, they haven't rejected what she agreed to with Trump, two things. Number one, that the Europeans will spend $750 billion on energy from the United States. And on top of it, another roughly the same amount of money to be invested in the United States, European money to be invested in the United States. Okay, this reminds me of the Marshall Plan. If you remember, the Marshall Plan was a plan presented to the world as the largesse of the United States in helping Europe rebuild after World War II. If you actually read what the Marshall Plan said, it gave loans to the Europeans on condition that the loans would be spent on American products. In other words, this was a fiscal stimulus to the United States alongside of the highway building program, the housing program, and other governmental stimulus programs that came after World War II, because the United States was terrified that with the end of the war, we'd slip back into the Great Depression, which is where the war began. Okay, we are now saying to the Europeans who are having gross troubles of their own, you're going to have to buy your energy from us, which is a signal to the American producers, who aren't that many, to jack up their prices, since the Europeans have no option. If they want to be okay with tariffs, they have to pay, because there was no proviso about what the price of that energy would be, just how much they would spend. And then your European politicians are going to go to their own people and say $750 billion that might have been spent by Europeans in Europe are now not going to be spent in Europe to create jobs, but in the United States, so that we have a lower tariff, which is hurting us. How do you go to your people in Europe to win an election doing such things?
I don't think you win elections on this, but this is also why we have a political legitimacy crisis across Europe. I mean, from Britain, France, Germany, these are widely unpopular government. People do not like them, but I think you identified the problem correctly. Where Europe is deindustrializing, the economies are going south, and I mean, in the middle of all of this, of course, what little money might be left has to be spent now on inflated energy prices from the United States. Whatever money is left over has to be reinvested into the United States. And even one of the dreams of developing our own technology, as suggested before, would be to pursue some military Keynesianism. But now we have to buy the weapons from the US as well. So it's all the economic plans seem to be dead in the water. But there is no ability to rebuild or diversify either. And it seems to me that everything is premised on the idea that we have to keep the Americans locked into Europe, because in a multipolar system, it's also the United States which has other priorities, and they will go. So I think they just want to keep Trump's interest in Europe and try to wait him out. And hopefully the president will be an ideologue who will link America's future closer to that of Europe. And I think this is why they're doing these things. I mean, when von der Leyen showed up at Trump's golf course, can't even to sign whatever papers, agreements he has put in front of her, the Europeans recognized this was a bad idea. That is a bad economic deal, but they justified it based on security. That we have a war in Europe now. We need the Americans behind us. But then you would think that the conclusion would be we have to end this war, because as long as there's a war, we have a massive security dependence on the United States, and the US can convert its security dependence into economic and political loyalties, which are very bad for us. But we don't. Instead, we have our leaders line up in front of his desk like little school children, referring to him as daddy, at the same time as he's telling about how awful the EU is and how it should be broken, and it's time for the Europeans to pay back, and they bow there. And so it's quite a pathetic display. But I think
I don't mean to alarm people, but I would tell you, I don't think this is limited to Mr. Trump. I think what he is doing, it's a little bit like what we just said about the Ukraine war. He's not a polished politician. You can see that. He speaks too quickly. He has the same limited understanding that conventional businessmen in the United States have. They have a set of opinion. Taxes are no good because they don't like seeing that money go out the door. The idea that the tax is what holds the society together, they don't want that information because that makes it complicated. That means there's a cost. They want it nice and neat, but he puts it out there. He's direct. He mocks the conventional politician who deserves it because they are busily pretending to be other than what they are. But I would say that he has shifted the conversation. Is it possible that there will be a blowback, a kind of pendulum swinging back away from him? Yes, that's certainly a possibility. But even if there is, I would tell you, Europe is making a terrible mistake to wait this out. It's not so clear. What are they waiting for? The United States to be MAGA, to be great again? That's not going to happen. That's not hasn't happened now for 30 years. I keep having to remind the United States lost the war in Vietnam. It lost the Communist Party of Vietnam is in charge. That was the enemy then. The Taliban is in charge in Afghanistan. That was the enemy of the United States there. The United States lost. The people that tried to overthrow in Iraq, they're still there. And the people in Ukraine that it's trying to overthrow, that's not working out well either. So, I mean, it's lose, 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 lose. And you were what? You were the richest country in the world, more so in 1975 than now. The disparity between you and your enemy was greater then than it is now. You were fighting wars then against some of the poorest countries on the planet: Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. My God, what a collection of poverty-stricken and you still couldn't win. Meanwhile, Russia and China are immensely richer, more developed economically, more developed military. Come on, you need a level of blindness and denial that is becoming too difficult even for Americans to sustain. Again, where we started, I'm in New York City. All my life, from the time I was born, I'm born in Ohio, right in the middle of the United States. From the time I was born to this minute, I have lived in a society that has demonized socialism, communism, Marxism, anarchism, all of that. In fact, those words I just uttered are dealt with in our culture as synonyms. They're interchangeable. Mr. Trump the other day did an interesting thing. He was explaining why he, as president, will not allow Zoran Mamdani to become the next mayor of New York City because he's a socialist, as if Mr. Trump had that power, which he does not. But he says, like always, he says what's on his mind. He corrected himself. He said, no, he's not a socialist. And everybody's looking, he isn't? No, he's a communist. You know, those of us who have a sense what these words mean started to laugh. He realized that in America, the word socialist no longer functions to dismiss you as irrelevant to the political realities of the society. A socialist is the winner here in New York, won the Democratic Party, defeated Mr. Cuomo, who's a stalwart member of the Democratic Party establishment, former governor of the state of New York, et cetera, wiped him out. I mean, didn't just defeat him, overwhelmingly defeated him. And who's a Muslim. I mean, the only thing that we've demonized worse than socialists and communists in recent years is Muslims. And he's going to, it's a communist. He had to admit in that peculiar way that after 75 years of indoctrination, the level of indoctrination is so thin that we can now get a Muslim socialist elected mayor of New York. And New York City is the residence of choice of more than half of the billionaires in the United States who live here in New York, within 10-minute walk of where I'm sitting at this moment. I think you're watching enormous changes unfold in this country. The visible ones are on the right, but don't be surprised by that. After 75 years of relentless demonization of everything to the left, everything, it is logical that when the working class can't stand it anymore, they go to the right. That's the available place to go. They've heard about that. They've had some leaders do that. They understand that. That's been told to them day in and day out in the school, in the media, in the church, no matter where you go. But you know, the right wing isn't solving anything. Our unemployment is worsening. Our inflation is not under control. The job picture is awful. You know, there is no solution here. And one of the things you're seeing is the desperation of Mr. Trump. He too gets it. And part of the reason they have to dismiss their allies, and that, look, Europe is important, but Mexico and Canada are more important, and they're savaging them. The Trump people are savaging the relationship between Canada and Mexico on the one hand and the United States on the other. And if they're doing that, and I'm watching that, they're going to do whatever is necessary. Europe disappears. And they're going to play the Europeans against one another. If you ask me in private, but we're not in private, so I'll say it anyway. Why don't the Europeans push back? The suspicion here among many of us, myself included, is that they are afraid that each of the European leaders, particularly the major ones, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, maybe Spain, they're afraid of each other. Will one of them become the favorite of the United States in a program to savage the others? Will that be Britain? Be your first guess, given history, but not necessarily. Maybe a new government. Maybe if the Alternative für Deutschland wins, Mr. Vance will continue to be the liaison, and Germany, a new Germany, will become the partner. And the rest of you in Europe will understand what happened. It's not just that Europe went down, but that Europe was removed from the category of equal to the category of colony. But with one exception, Germany. It will be given the pride of place. It will be given the deals, and the rest of Europe will become subservient to Germany. You know who had that idea in their mind. Were he alive, he might be smiling about how this is being arranged. Otherwise, it's hard to explain the inability of the Europeans to get together to do anything other than grovel.
Well, I think fear is probably a very important variable here, but it's been 80 years though of living in the basement of Uncle Sam. It's been it's the chains becomes comforting after a while, and also the U.S. is a ticket to extending the life of Europe, our ticket to greatness. If we would stand side by side with the U.S., part of the liberal hegemony, this was the unipolar dream, and but also when the U.S. leaves, that's the pacifier. The concern is that the Europeans will start to turn on each other, and you do see some of that already. And possibly a problem is also political imagination. We had this, Europe never were able to work together unless, except for the last 80 years, under America's, imperial leadership. I don't think we have any imagination or bravery to consider a different solution. And but most of all, I think it's after hundreds of years, as said, of European leadership, we're the ones sitting at the table, moving the pieces around. The recognition that we have become one of the pieces which is now being moved around by the U.S., that we're not the subject anymore. We've gone to being the object. This is humiliating, and it's there's some panic. So, and there's no solutions to this. But I don't know. Say what you will about the U.S., though. I mean, if we put morals aside, at least they seem to be, they're, as the war in Ukraine has gone bad, we were unable to use the Ukrainians to knock out Russia from the ranks of great powers. We see now that the U.S. is doing what is pragmatic. It's outsourcing the whole war to the Europeans so they can finance it. They can take the blame for it. They're stripping Ukraine of assets. They're pillaging their European allies. I mean, they're again, morals aside, they are adjusting to new realities. The Europeans, not so much. They will go down with this ship, it seems.
Yeah, I'm struck by your comment, which I agree with. Your comment that the last 80 years, whatever else you have to say about them, or as you put it, morals aside, which is a requirement if you're going to be nice to these 80 years, reminds me of a conversation I had with a Chinese economist from China, who points out that there are big debates in China, and there have been, that they have to go slow and careful in their economic development, particularly in relationship to the United States. And why? Your answer. Whatever we say about the world, the context of the world economy within which China went from one of the poorest countries on earth to the economic powerhouse it is today is under the umbrella, like Europe, of the United States and of Western hegemony inherited out of World War II. We must be very careful to understand how much of that was sustaining us, enabling us, enriching us before we, in our revolutionary or critical moment, cut off something and then discover we needed it. It is using their language, a dialectical process where we have to understand the contradictions. We are not deferential to Mr. Trump because we're afraid he's going to nuke us. I mean, of course, that's in the mind of everybody nowadays, but it's not just that sort of negative, avoid the horror. It's also sustain what has sustained us. Make the change so that you're aware that you're doing the best you can, not to get rid of the supports as you. And then, and this I thought was really wonderful, then this same economist says to me, in a way, that's history. It's always true that the revolution comes as a great disappointment to the people who are the objects of the revolution, who are being thrown out, because they say, well, look at all we did for you. It's true. You did a lot for us. You know, it's the complaint, if you allow me, it's the complaint of the parent with the rebellious child. The very rebellion of the child is itself the product of the parent. The ability of the child to see a better way, a different path, is something enabled, in most cases, by the parent, willingly or not. That's part of life. You have to adjust. If you stay with the old, as the old passes, it no longer plays the role. You're not getting the benefits and the costs. You have to adjust to that. You can't keep pretending that because there are some benefits, you don't have to worry about the costs. No. That's the same mistake as the Chinese was cautioning me against. Don't overestimate the costs lest you lose the benefits. You've got to navigate the contradiction, not pretend that it isn't there. This is an extremely valuable lesson, and I think it's a lesson the Europeans have yet to digest and make part of their own.
No, that's a great lesson, actually. So, well, I will spend some time thinking about that myself. So, thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure, Glenn, and thank you for having a program that does this. These kinds of conversations are both rare and urgently necessary.
Very much agree. Thanks.